And we're just days away from the Great American Eclipse, and by now you could probably figure out what to expect here in the upstate. No totality, but pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close. Close enough. B-minus grade, as we found out last night from Kendra,
right.
about 82%. But if you're wondering how the science behind it works, our first Alert Meteorologist Bryan Bachman explains.
A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes in front of the sun and casts its shadow onto Earth. The eclipse can either be partial or total depending on the exact position of the Earth, moon, and sun. And while the crescent sun produced by a partial solar eclipse can be quite the sight, a total solar eclipse is much more spectacular. Now, part of the reason this is even possible is because the sun is about 400 times larger than the moon. And just to give you an idea of how that size compares, if we could fit the sun down into the studio here, the moon is barely even that visible tiny speck there next to the sun. Now, fortunately for our eclipse viewing here on Earth, the sun is also about 400 times farther from Earth than the moon actually is. The end result is that the two appear roughly the same size in the sky when viewed from Earth, and as such, under the correct conditions, the moon can completely block out the sun for a brief time. Now, getting the moon in the right place for a total solar eclipse is pretty tricky, though. Now, the moon doesn't orbit Earth on a nice level plane like you see here. Instead, it actually orbits the Earth at an incline of about 5 degrees. At the same time, the entire Earth-Moon system itself is tilted at about 23.5 degrees. And as the Earth makes its way around the sun throughout the year, the southern and northern hemispheres take turns pointing toward and away from the sun. And at the same time, the moon is continuing on its monthly orbit around our planet, so there are times where if you imagine the moon casting its shadow out into space from the sun, where perhaps the moon is too low, so to speak, in space, or too high, so to speak, in space, but every so often, right there, you get that just right alignment during a new moon when the moon's shadow can be cast onto the Earth. In fact, there are at least 2 solar eclipses on Earth each year, but up to 5 can occur in a single year with the right timing. Even so, total solar eclipses usually only occur once every 18 months. Even when we get the right alignment for a total solar eclipse, you need to be in the right place at the right time to be able to see it. The moon's shadow moves along Earth's surface at about 1,100 miles per hour, and only locations near the center of the shadow are able to witness the total eclipse. This area, known as the path of totality, is often around 100 to 150 miles wide, but can be a few thousand miles long. While the entire eclipse can last around 3 hours from start to finish, totality only lasts about 2 to 5 minutes. Locations outside the path of totality can still see a partial eclipse, but the degree of eclipse decreases the farther away you are. This year's eclipse will be at least partially visible across the entire continental United States, but the path of totality will span parts of only 14 states from Texas to Maine. Western Kentucky or Southwest Ohio are the closest places to us that will see totality, nearly 8 hours away. And now to take a closer look at locations in the path of totality for this year's solar eclipse. At around 1:27 Central Time or 2:27 Eastern Time, the moon's shadow will move from Mexico into south central Texas, reaching places around Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, Texas, for example, by about 1:40 p.m. Central Time. Then moving on quickly off toward the northeast, it crosses southeast Oklahoma, moves into central Arkansas just 12 minutes after it passes through Fort Worth and Dallas onto Little Rock and Hot Springs, Arkansas by 1:52 Central Time. Quick pass through southeast Missouri, southern Illinois, brings it into the Eastern Time Zone. Indianapolis, Bloomington, Indiana, seeing totality around maximum at 3:07 p.m. Quickly off through Toledo, Cleveland by about 3:15 p.m. Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, Rochester, New York, Watertown, New York, Burlington, Vermont, and then eventually off through northern Maine and out into Canada at 3:35 Eastern Time. The entire process of totality in the United States wrapping up in little more than just an hour's time. This will be the last total solar eclipse visible in the United States until 2044. The Carolinas are far from the path of totality this time around, but the eclipse will still peak at around 82% in Greenville at 3:09 p.m. on April 8th. If you want to catch a total solar eclipse in Greenville, you have to wait until May 11th, 2078. That's your moment of science. I'm Bryan Bachman.